Good afternoon, Southern Institutions back in action. We have with us Mr. David Sheets, the State Curator, Department of Buildings and General Services, and he's going to go through Section 1, State House Replacement of Historic Interior Finishes. Mr. Sheets, welcome to Southern Institutions.
Thank you, Senator, and congratulations
Thank
on your new office here.
Thank you.
And a few of you have been here, a few of you are new to this, and I welcome the opportunity to talk about the State House, which among your many responsibilities is of course at the top of your list. Is it not?
Yes, because we live here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think because you have new people, I thought I would start with just a little history
We
of
like that.
how the State House came to be here at this point in history and where we hope it will be going in the future. I arrived at the State House in 1979 as a research assistant on a project that was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts to look at the State House for the first time with critical eyes. Was it in fact functioning successfully as a museum? What at the time we called the M word, because people in the building at that time did not, quite frankly, think that it was a museum. And I'm referring to the legislators at the time mostly, who knew that it was their workplace, knew that it's where the legislature met, but were a little oblivious to the incidental audiences that the State House has. And we have many different audiences. But the principal audience that they'd gotten used to was the Sergeant at Arms office, had a brochure that they would hand out to people if they inquired in their office. No tours, no real way of reaching out to people in the way that I think we've certainly since made it work. There were 3 recommendations to the legislature from the study that was done. Inventory the collection at the time, and what happened in 1971, 50 years ago, was an unfortunate renovation of the building that did not take it into consideration as an historic building. Consequently, this room, all of the rooms on the first floor, had drop ceilings with fluorescent lights. Out in the hallways, there were big white plastic ball lighting fixtures. And all the furniture in the chambers as well, covered in brown naga hide, which was the fabric of choice in 1971. Lots of bad things. They put in an HVAC system that is the very one that you're dealing with right now, still. So that 50-year-old HVAC system is still haunting us, even though other things have been happily addressed. And so those 3 recommendations were to restore the State House, appoint a curator for the first time, thus acknowledging it maybe was a museum, and the third, start a private nonprofit organization that could help the state get there with all of the challenges of
one man who could do it
like
that's
that.
you.
No, there were many people, as you know, Senator, more than anybody,
You did the
because you've known a lot of those people.
most. Yeah, but you did
And
the most.
what the person who stepped up to the plate, who was one of the most important people, was Barbara Snelling, who agreed to be the first chair of the board of the Friends of the State House. And we had a little trouble at the beginning of this project because the Sergeant at Arms at that time, a man named Reed Payne, I don't know if you ever knew him, but came from the Rutland region. He had been a legislator, moved into the Sergeant at Arms office, and he had been the Sergeant at Arms office long enough that that long ago renovation of the 60s and 70s was done with him. So he didn't completely understand why we needed to undo any of that. And he stood in the way of our plan to have a curator, et cetera. Thus, the governor, Richard Snelling, the only part of the building that was not under Reed's domain was the governor's office. So the Friends were able to restore the governor's office as the first major chamber in the building to go back to being restored, hired a restoration architect to work with us on a plan, and the Friends paid for the entire restoration of that room. It was a chance to show what restoration could do to the building at large, and it worked, because shortly thereafter, people started realizing maybe the State House could look a little different, and we went from there. Year after year, looking at the construction season, coming to this committee and the House committee for funds to very slowly move our way through the building until we did the House chamber. And Dick remembers all too well, I'm sure, that the carpet that was laid in the House chamber was a little hard for the senators to appreciate. They got a little scared of what we might do to their chamber, and consequently asked that we start to restore the first floor of the State House, these rooms, which were not part of the original plan. The original plan was to address the major chambers, and we weren't quite sure whether we dared go in the Senate committee rooms, because we knew, for one thing, that the HVAC system, that same HVAC system, had duct work between the original ceilings and the lowered drop ceilings. And that duct work was delivering the HVAC. So what other solution was there? We carved tunnels under the building, because this building rests on the bedrock of this hillside behind it. And there is very little basement under here. There's a small amount of basement at this end of the building, but the rest of it, literally bedrock, carved out tunnels for relocating those ducts. And we're able consequently to go back to the original ceilings, replaster, and introduce more appropriate gas lights and carpets and finishes. And some of the committee rooms you may notice are white with ivory colored woodwork, such as this. They're going back to the 1859 period of the building itself. Other committee rooms were restored to a somewhat later period that corresponds with the Cedar Creek room. And those are the colored rooms. So any room down here that is colored has stenciling. Judiciary is an excellent example. Those are the original stencils that we were able to restore to the ceiling of that room, and the original colors from the 1880s, 90s. So it's 1850s and 1880s, 90s that are the two periods that we have now restored the building to. And later, in the early 2000s, we even went into the House committee rooms, and they were created around 1920 out of the old State Library space that had since moved to the building over here. And when those were created, we put in finishes that brought them back as well to the 1920s. So now we have a beautifully restored building. Part of it, by the way, the Senate eventually voted on the carpet that is in that chamber. They and the Friends agreed to pay for the whole restoration of the Senate chamber. So that wasn't done with state money, nor was the beginning. So kind of the beginning and the end were both funded by the Friends. They also paid for the Cedar Creek room to be restored. So nobody wants a group like the Friends to have to go through decades, as they did in the 1980s and 90s. No one wants to go through this ever again. And yet, some of the restoration, the governor's office is an excellent example, dates back to the 1980s now, with finishes that were put into that room at that time. They're looking a little tired, a little faded, and what I was 26 when I arrived. I'm now pushing 70. So my retirement is coming at some point, yet to be identified on purpose, because I'm not quite sure what the hell I would do. When you will spend pretty much your entire adult life doing this, I'm not sure I want to give it up. But I know that at some point I will have to. And what will really disappoint me is if we have not done enough to establish a cycle of maintenance that will ensure that the State House will never backslide into what had happened to the building over time. Here's one of the interesting things. One of the projects that we did 5 years ago was write this book, Intimate Grandeur, Vermont State House. And I spent quite a few years writing this book, but I realized it was never going to happen until I had a partner. So the Friends hired Nancy Graff, a wonderful historian here in Montpelier, to be my partner. And Nancy's a fabulous writer herself. So we were finally able to get this printed. Intimate Grandeur is a bit of a celebration of the restoration of the building, but it's also the history of all three buildings that served as the State House. When we started our research for this book, Nancy and I said to ourselves, Vermont is a state that is most famous for its barns, its general stores. When I think of the historic buildings, we're talking about relatively humble rural buildings. And in the middle of the 19th century, they erected a Capitol building that competed with all the other state capitals of the time in terms of its grandeur. That's why Intimate Grandeur is the title on purpose, because this building is grand. This is the grandest building in Vermont, I would submit. And why? What's so important about the workplace of people's government being housed in such grandeur, especially when you appreciate this little tidbit? A legislative session in 1859 was a couple weeks max. So then the question arose, what was the State House used for the rest of the year? And we dug a lot into references to try to find an answer to that question. And it was what you might guess. It was like a big town hall. It is a gathering place. And so the people of Montpelier used it a lot. The people in the immediate area, in other words. But it was also used by statewide organizations who gathered in Montpelier, reunions of soldiers, reunions of legislators. years. And it was bustling. It was busy. It was a cultural hub for Vermont. And that the rest of the time, it was also a government building, but the government part was actually small at that time.
We didn't have the back, right? It was just this building.
That's correct. It was only this building. And then in the 1880s, they added the wing on the west that it was for a state library and the Supreme Court chamber. So your lounge, what we call the lounge today, was the original Supreme Court chamber, the very first.
Yep.
Because they didn't have a chamber until the 1880s when that was built. So that was added on, and they moved the state library out of the Cedar Creek room. So the Cedar Creek room didn't look the way it did. There's a picture in here of it as the state library.
Where do we get those books? Where do you buy them?
These are, so this is.
Elected, we got him
This,
being elected.
yes.
Yeah.
Did?
You should.
Dick, do you not have this?
No, no.
Okay.
I don't either.
We got
Okay.
it, right?
Yeah.
I'm giving you copies. I'm giving you copies. Are you kidding?
It's a great book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As long as, the only deal here is,
Yeah.
Oh, it's on
Yeah.
the string. Be
you
careful.
do have to read it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'll read it the first night I got it.
Yeah. And then, of course, you do have to, of course, give David Sheets whatever he needs.
Yes.
And,
They already did that.
but I'm sorry, are we being recorded?
Yeah.
Yikes. All right. So anyway,
I was only kidding.
I do want you guys to be well informed
Yeah.
as we set up what will possibly allow for my retirement at last. But until we go through the motions of actually replacing some of the restoration before I leave, and one other thing, possibly adding on to the State House for a fourth time, which you might think that I wouldn't be in favor of that.
Yeah, I would think so.
But the pressures on the historic building are so great that I worry about its future now. And post-pandemic, I worry more than I ever did before. Because all you have to do is wander through the building right now. Every seat in the entire building is being camped on by somebody with a laptop. Because Janet and I just had this conversation. We're noticing that a lot of people have probably given up their offices. They're working remotely, and they're working remotely here. And they're not having to pay rent anymore for offices. So they come to the State House and take up virtually every space they can find and spend the whatever amount of time they have to in the building. And they'll go elsewhere eventually. But, and then there are the visitors, and they haven't come back in the numbers yet that we expect as we begin to emerge from the pandemic. But we're expecting school groups. Our largest audience during this time of the year are the school groups. We get more than any other place in Vermont by far. So when those build back, hordes of school children will start to come into the building. And I'm saying this, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm not stressed by all of that because that's what the State House is for. We stand in the House and Senate chambers and proudly tell our tour groups, these are the two oldest legislative chambers in the United States that are in their original condition, that's key, and still actively being used for the same purpose for which they were built 160 some years ago. And those two things together are what make this building special. Not that it's been beautifully restored, which it was, and is not quite as lovely as it was pre-pandemic. We're still working on that. The technology that has roared into the building because of the pandemic is not a concern of mine. I'm fine with a zillion of these as long as they are not in the chambers. I am not giving an inch on that yet. I'm hoping, I mean, there still are 2 in the House chamber, for example, right now. That's just because we're slowly, and Kevin Moore, your IT director, I love him. He is sensitive to my world, and we work very well together. And that Kevin is giving me the comfort that I otherwise would not have about emerging from what and having these things all over the place. My recognition is this, because this is just as important to me, that this building as a museum be as open and inclusive and welcoming to every single Vermonter as it possibly can be. And if we don't have better ADA access to the building itself, we are failing in that mission. So that, Senator, is one of the reasons I'm in favor of an expansion, because I know the House committee rooms are woefully inadequate. If we don't do something about that, we'll never get rooms 9, 10, and 11 back as general use rooms, which I think they are needed for. And the second part of that is that in the tourist season, from June to the end of October, when we get more visitors than anyone other than the Shelburne Museum and Ben and Jerry's, we're the 3 top tourist draws in the state. So we won't get the ability to use those rooms right off the main lobby for gallery space. That is part of the new interpretive plan, that legislation that you passed in the last couple years. That is about to become public for the first time. And it calls for the use of rooms 9, 10, and 11 for new purposes that allow us to bring in additional ways of interpreting storytelling that goes beyond governors of Vermont and the military collection. As you know, last May, we unveiled the portrait of Alexander Twilight out in the lobby. The Friends of the State House paid for that at my request. Where I'm about to ask them to do it again with another portrait of Clarina Howard Nichols, the very first woman's suffragist, who in the 1850s, before the Civil War, addressed the legislature from the rostrum in the House chamber and asked for women's rights, asked for the right to vote, long before they ultimately got it 100 years ago.
Was it 246 members of the House up into 1960? My dad.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it was that number, Dick, that that number was 246 until 1965.
Yeah.
And it was-
it was 150.
It was as soon as that happened that the renovation of the State House, the bad renovation of the 1960s, 70s, was done in part triggered by the reconfiguration of all of the desks and chairs in the House chamber.
Okay.
And from there, they went, hey, why don't we have air conditioning? Why don't we have, they'd never had air conditioning until then. So they put an HVAC system in, I don't know if some of you remember, that was hung from the upper gallery of the House chamber and actually enveloped the Corinthian columns that are supporting it. It was god awful. They also shortened the chandelier by pulling it up to the ceiling so that TV cameras could get shots across the chamber without it being in the way. Anyway, lots of bad things happened, but the beauty of this building, unlike many other state capitals, is that we still treat this building, even today, and certainly before there was a curator, as a gathering place. And that is, it's a big town hall. And we have a new publication that we just put out this year called Freedom and Unity. You may have seen copies of it as a graphic piece that is now being used by school groups to learn about civics, because civics is at the heart of what we're trying to do here in the State House now, not only with student groups, but with all Vermonters, because we all need to learn why this building is important, why the people like you are here representing them in the process, this democratic process that we need to celebrate and that we need to educate people about.
So what's it for you though, seriously, we would be where we are today?
I second that.
Well,
You're the
you're
one.
very kind.
No, you're the one, no one there goes against. Would you say, because you know this place backwards, frontwards, sideways,
Yes.
you made it what it is today. Without, and I say this, I've been here all the time, without you, we would not have all the things restored back.
So I'd like David to talk
I
about.
stood on the shoulders, though. You may remember Arthur Williams.
Yeah.
Danny Robbins, who was the art historian from Dartmouth College, who hired me as his research assistant, and all of those friends, people that we worked with very hard to change the minds of lawmakers of the past about what the State House could be, and that happened. So thank you.
So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about,
Yeah.
because as we go through, you know, society changes. There was a time when, and although it doesn't look like it, this was all we depended on. We didn't have.
I know,
There were papers all over the place.
exactly.
You could smoke at one time in probably every building or every room of the building. I was gonna mention, you mentioned this.
So spittoons, and we have a collection of approximately 25 of the surviving spittoons that we still have. We also have the cylindrical ashtrays that were brought into the State House in 1971.
Oh,
The cafeteria was built in 1986. And you know those glass walls?
yeah.
Those were put in because the smokers were on one side and the non-smokers were on the other
No
side.
kidding.
I never knew that.
So even in
Like they were in the house, everybody was smoking pipes, tobacco, cigars, you couldn't even see in that room. I never smoked, and I was in there with all these guys, with 12 members, 13 members, you couldn't even breathe in there. Yeah, I'm telling you, it was a small committee room in the house, and I was in transportation over there also, but it was unbelievable. I couldn't say a word. You don't like it, get out, you know, they were all sat there.
And
It's a fire hazard.
if I'm not mistaken, the legislation forbidding smoking in public places was passed in this building, and the State House had an exemption for a while. Yeah, it had an exemption for a while.
It's a nice day.
But the
So
paper
anyway.
must have been different. I mean,
Totally.
I can't imagine how much paper they must have.
And Farmers Night is gonna be tonight, you know, that goes back well over 100 years, when lawmakers came to Montpelier, had to stay here,
Yeah, right.
all of them, in the boarding houses and hotels, and had nothing to do on Wednesday nights. That's why it's always Wednesday night, because they needed to entertain themselves in the hall of, and it started with them performing, and then it went into the VSO and all kinds of other wonderful things. So it's the cultural life of the State House, in addition to the governmental. And what I love about Vermont is that the two kind of converge a lot. And this building is a great celebration of that convergence. It has its own culture. I don't know about you, Dick, but I look back at the 1980s and 90s. I'm very fond of a lot of those people, but I honestly think that the culture of this place is a better culture. And it is most assuredly a culture that is no longer dominated by certain elements of Vermont society. It is growing into a place where I honestly think every Vermonter stands an excellent chance of feeling that this building belongs to them. And that is key to the addition to the building, because in the rear, it is anything but a welcoming but when we opened our doors for the first time during the pandemic, and it was only the west rear door that we were using, that's when we recognized, because people come in that door and you can put all the signage up you want, but they have no idea where they're going. They have no idea where the main lobby is or anything else. And it's not the way it should be. So why am I saying this to you? Because I personally am in favor of adding on to the State House so that we can finally create that atrium in the rear that will give us a circular floor circulation that would open up the hallway behind Abraham Lincoln and allow people to come in that direction to the main lobby and go from there. It would also allow us to make this building truly accessible, in a wide variety of ways. And those are things that we're touching upon in the interpretive plan, because it makes no sense to talk about, more women on the walls of the State House, etc., if we're not open and welcoming to every Vermonter, particularly those with disabilities and other ways that prevent them from appreciating the building as much as anybody else, and participating in their government. I mean, this is like, it should be pretty easy to suggest that of all the buildings in Vermont that needs to be as welcoming and as open and inclusive as possible, shouldn't the State House be at the top of that list? So anyway, back to the finishes, because that's the item that you're looking at. Draperies and carpets has been a challenge in the pandemic. We have a gentleman under contract, David Hunt, who knows everything about historic carpets. And he is the person with whom we are working. But he has been difficult to nail down to any kind of schedule. He is not easy to communicate with. So we finally kind of lost our patience with him and decided to investigate other options. And those other options are now the ones that we're working toward. We are hoping this coming summer and into the fall, we will be working on the governor's office to renew its carpet, to put in a new carpet in the card room. And in addition, we're told recently, very recently, that the ramp up to the cafeteria is apparently not ADA compliant. So we're going to possibly change the pitch of that ramp, and so that it conforms to the ADA. When it was built, ADA may have had a different standard than it does today. This is news. That's brand new information that Janet just received very recently. But her office, working with BGS, is where we hope to go, in terms of beginning to look, as you will, at options for what we think the big drivers are for trying to make the State House everything that it can be in as modest a way as possible, but recognizing the pressures on the building that need to be addressed.
Which one is yours over here?
Thirty-one.
31.
It's $695,000, you only give you 50 grand?
No, that's over the
That's
life of,
the,
that's over
right,
the life of the act.
because we have not been able to successfully spend the money from the previous capital biennium. And that will happen this year though, finally. We've been having contractual issues and other things in the way of being able to successfully do that. One of the big things, simply trying to find people who can do drapes in Vermont anymore is a challenge. Nobody has drapes anymore. So,
You wanna keep that natural look. Yeah.
so drapes and carpets are not quite as easy as they once were. The carpet market has changed completely since we restored the State House, even where the big customers were hotels. Hotels did the kinds of rugs like this that we did back then, and we're not in a position to. We're also patching. We're doing all kinds of things to lengthen the life of many things. Some of the drapes do not need to be replaced, but they do need to be relined. So the lining of the drapes is often where the deterioration actually happens. And if we can try to lengthen the life of a drapery, lengthen the life of a carpet, those are strategies that we've already done. Up at the top of the stairs, we replace, because my storage area is full of remnants of these historic carpets and so on. And we have enough of them that we can actually successfully patch many of the rugs and just keep them going in the threadbare areas. But it has been 35 years for much of the restoration. So we're definitely at the end of some of the life cycles, and we need to go through the motions in the governor's office, which will set us into a cycle of maintenance that I hope will stand us in good stead thereafter.
Do you have any restrictive covenants to say as far as for the Friends of the State House of what that money needs to be used for versus the monies that you received from the legislature?
No, if I'm understanding you, the renewal of finishes in the building is no longer on the Friends.
Okay,
right?
so they're no longer,
They were willing to do their part to bring the State House back, right? But I think we can all agree that the simple way of thinking about what the Friends ought to raise money for and what the state needs to raise money for is that all Vermont, if this is in fact the people's house, that this is the way I would describe it to you. If this is the people's house, then don't all of the people need to pay for it to be maintained? That would be my expectation.
Sure.
So if that's the simple way, then we begin to get into program, meaning how do you appreciate the State House, visitors to the State House. The Friends are still our way of extending the reach beyond what the state has to pay.
Yeah.
So they're much more into, I need a portrait of Clarina Howard Nichols.
Yeah.
There is no such portrait. So we need to paint one. We need to go through what we did with Alexander Twilight, have a competition. They awarded the contract to Katie Runde. We're about to celebrate that, by the way, in Farmers Night. One of February 22nd, we'll have a Farmers Night that's all about Alexander Twilight with music, as well as Bill Hart from the Middlebury College faculty talking about his life as the first African-American legislator in the United States, not just Vermont. That's what's truly amazing. One of the whitest states in the nation, we had the very first African-American legislator, which is pretty crazy. But and complicated, right? So it's racial identity is part of what that is going to be about. Explain. He's not a person who, said that he was African American. It would have been to his disadvantage to say such.
Do you need a bill to get this cyclical process non-statute?
No, I'm here simply to explain to you what your money that you've already appropriated for this purpose is doing and where we're headed. And I'm very comfortable with what the governor has recommended to keep that cycle moving along.
Okay. So you have 100,000, 50 coming from the cash fund, which is probably pretty safe. The other 50 is a one-time appropriation for the governor, part of the 62 million. I can't imagine that there's gonna be somebody in here that wants to take that money. But there are other people that are gonna have to worry about that. But
Sure.
we don't speak for all, but I think this committee, with just reading the room, is pretty in favor of making sure you get your $100,000 one way or the other.
We're with you.
As long as you got your books.
Yeah.
Where?
I would be glad to pay.
Totally
Oh, I don't know about the Senate.
Yeah. But I think you're probably pretty safe. I think you're probably pretty safe in this room. And,
Allison is here.
I feel safe.
yeah.
I feel quite safe in this room. I don't-
So,
just,
Yeah.
it's a mutual
Good
safety
job, good
going on.
job, boy.
when was the governor last in his office, as far as that was his official duty office?
So in the 1971 renovation,
Yeah.
that was a critical decision that they made. We are going to create, so just so you know, the battle in the 1960s to save the Pavilion Hotel was an enormous historic preservation moment in Vermont, as well as the nation. The New York Times had the proposed demolition of the Pavilion Hotel on the front page of the New York Times, actually, and the battle that was going on in Vermont over whether to save it or to demolish it. And that was a pivotal moment. That was over 50 years ago now. So the current pavilion is now a 50-year-old building, which means that it's eligible for being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And I'm in conversation with Laura Trishman and others at the Division for Historic Preservation to actually do that, because it was a key moment. It was a bit of a turning point, in other words, in Vermont in terms of the historic preservation movement in general. They failed to save the building, but they came up with a novel solution that nobody in their right mind would ever do today, and that is that Pizza Galley stepped forward as the contractor and said that they would replicate the exterior of the hotel on a 1971 office building, and it would end up being cheaper. That's the part that can't be true. And no one will admit to this yet, but we're working on it, because to demolish the building entirely and then to completely rebuild it had to have been more expensive. And we're fairly confident that Pizza Galley decided to eat that extra expense because they wanted to move on this project, and they came up with their own novel solution to the problem. So
That's interesting.
that meant that the governor's office had the opportunity to move off-site for the first time. And so the 5th floor, which is our jargon today for West Wing, ended up in the pavilion. And for the first time, the governor, I am one of those people who does not call it the ceremonial office of the governor. to distinguish the two. This is his State House office. It's like you guys, he moves into the building when you move into the building. We don't call your chambers ceremonial. So that's his working office during this time of the year, as is the other. But happily, he leaves the building. That opens up that room for tourists in all the other seasons, and even during this season when we bring the school groups into the governor's office occasionally and so on. So that that is still a working office, and that's one of the things we're going to have to work with the governor on, is to make sure he's good with our plan to replace the drapes. They won't look the way they do right now because those are the Peter Shumlin drapes, meaning the old drapes had deteriorated silk, red silk, heavy and dark. And Peter Shumlin wanted something lighter. So the white gauzy undercurrent curtains, and we have valances made of the old red silk. So we recycled the red silk into those valances. And our proposal for the governor's office is to actually go back to what it had prior to that, and which had been there until Governor Shumlin changed that for his purposes. Anyway.
So is the governor's office acting kind of like the historic preservation folks in terms of approving what goes in next with your recommendation?
Well, I just, as the occupant of that office,
Yeah.
I'm hoping and fairly confident that he will support returning it to what it had been prior to Peter Shumlin.
Right.
He knew it then, by the way. The governor was here, right?
Interesting.
So he was working in this very room.
So is there a formal historic preservation process, you know, when the building gets renovated? Or is it?
I mean, we certainly keep the Division for Historic Preservation informed
Okay,
of changes, but interior changes are really not what the division gets into,
right.
right? It's almost all exterior change. So they're more involved, I would say, when the Capitol Complex Commission does its work of reviewing any proposed changes to the exteriors of all of the buildings in the Capitol Complex that are historic. And certainly the division is at the table each time the commission meets, and if there's some kind of change. For example, we're putting up cameras on the lighting fixtures outside as well as inside. And they called Matt Romei, the Capitol Police, called in the division to meet and called me as well. And Laura and I reviewed what these cameras would be. We were alarmed at first, but then we started getting comfortable as they proposed different ways of mitigating the effect.
If she says no, it's not gonna happen.
No, you kind of are the
But-
historic preservation, you are the
Yeah.
historic preservation.
Well, I
Yeah.
am, but officially the division has legal responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
And we're certainly all very conscious of those legal responsibilities. But when it comes to the interiors, the State House went way past what any historic building would necessarily be held to.
And it's wonderful, it's
Yeah.
amazing,
Thank
and
you.
it's a privilege to serve here, and it really does make you think. It helps for me, my work, because I feel the privilege with the physical.
I truly think that is the reason the State House is as grand as it is.
Yeah.
And when you think about what it took for them to want a building of such grandeur and only use it a couple weeks per year, it's astonishing, you know, and it does make you take pause and wonder, wow, and you have to put yourself in their mindset too, to try to understand why that was important, so,
when the Civil War
Yeah.
was happening. So
Yeah,
just one other
exactly.
question about the Friends.
yeah.
Would that be a place where folks could donate?
Oh, yes.
Donate?
Oh, yeah, they send you.
Very much so.
Well, not,
Yeah.
yeah, but,
Okay.
but just, there
But
should
they
be
can
a place.
they can also donate directly because government itself gives the tax advantages.
Okay,
So, even directly to our collection.
okay,
All of the pieces that you're looking at, well, these two are borrowed from the Wood Art Gallery, so we have a long-standing relationship with the Thomas Waterman Wood Gallery here in Montpelier. He was a famous 19th century artist from Vermont, from Montpelier, and he established an art gallery well over 100 years ago, and their collection has long been loaned for many of the Senate committee rooms primarily. But our collection, mostly governor's portraits, which we felt, you know, Phil Scott will eventually join the ranks. And, but we usually don't do the governor's portrait till they're ready to leave office. And then I enter into that and help filter the artists that are ultimately selected to do another portrait for the state.
Who's the gentleman in the governor's, in the room? You don't call it a ceremonial room, but who's that big painting? Who's that
The
gentleman?
really large
Yeah.
one, that is Governor Charles Williams
Yeah.
of Rutland, who, whose friends were the funders. So the governor's portrait is never paid for by the state. So that's not something that'll ever come to you. They're always privately paid for by the governor and their admirers and supporters. So
Charles Wilson.
back then, he was the Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court after he left office as governor, and the Vermont Bar Association actually paid for the portrait. So that and George Washington are the two oldest portraits in the building, and they were both rescued from the fire that destroyed the previous State House. And to this day, they are the two largest portraits in the State House. Madeline Kunin and Howard Dean are close to their dimensions, but not quite as big.
Get your picture.
So,
Well, good. Any more questions for Mr. Sheets?
Oh, I could listen to them all
It's
day
just
long.
been wonderful, wonderful,
I'll
wonderful.
bring it in your.
And I'll trade you one. I have one for you.
I can't wait to get home.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
And I'll inscribe them, by the way. So leave them in here. I am rushing off to pick up Mary Leahy, the senator's sister, who is a longtime trustee of the Friends of the State House. Mary is coming to a social gathering. The Humanities Council's program is about John Lewis and the trilogy that Aaron Aiden wrote about John Lewis and the Civil Rights Movement. So we're all going to dinner at Sarducci's and then going to the Farmer's Night all together. So I have to dash out to Hollister Hill to pick her up. But tomorrow I will inscribe, if you leave these on your table, right, I'll come in and inscribe them all for you. All right.
Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome. Thank you for
Thank
having me.
you. No, thank you. Pleasure. An absolute positive pleasure.
My pleasure. All right.
Eric, are you just here to visit?
Alice was done with me upstairs. I came to see if David was still hard at work and
He was.
he didn't get into any trouble.
No, he did great. No, he smoothed and whatever, and that was all good, so.
He asked for
Yeah,
50,000, we're giving him 75.
Yeah.
Did you give him any extra money?
Yeah, we gave him a little extra. We said we gotta pull it out of the Eric Kilcorn retirement fund.
Oh my gosh, well, there goes my first